Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see you all on the screen. And so welcome to Michigan Resources on Climate and Land Change in Education monthly series for educators. My name is Elena Lioubimtseva. I'm a professor of geography and sustainable planning here at Grand Valley State University. And Miracle is a project of GVSU Climate Change Education Solutions Network and Michigan Space Grant. So we are very proud to continue this speaker series. This is the second year of the project, supported by the College of Liberal Arts and Science at GVSU and the Michigan Space Grant. And this year, we are focusing the entire year on the questions of climate vulnerability and climate justice. I'm here with my two colleagues, Deirdre Courtney and Janet Vale, and they would introduce themselves.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm Janet Vale. I work for Grand Valley State University at the Annis Water Resources Institute, but I also teach on our main campus. I teach environmental studies and also a science class for pre-service teachers. I'm the developer of the Michigan Environmental Education Curriculum Support Climate Change Unit, which is for basically sixth grade through high school. So it's a variety of lessons that were developed as part of a large grant to the state of Michigan.
Thank you. And I'd like to say welcome to everyone. My name is Deirdre Courtney, and I am currently a third year PhD student at Western Michigan University, where my focus is climate change, vulnerability, environmental justice, and migration. Also, I am a part-time instructor in the areas of environmental studies and anthropology. I'm very happy to be with everyone today. My work sort of spans over several topics as it relates to climate change and environmental justice. I do work in the community here in the city of Portage, Kalamazoo, and Grand Rapids, and just about anywhere my services are needed when we're trying to work on environmental justice issues. Also, I wanted to introduce Sam Bonzer, who couldn't be with us today, but he's a very integral part of our group this year. Sam is majoring in elementary education, and it's his final year at Grand Valley State University. As I mentioned, he's a member of the Miracle Project, and his role, you'll find out more about today, is essentially to develop and edit lesson plans that connect students to meet the educational standards, while also incorporating and discussing climate change within the classroom. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Elena. Thank you.
So a very quick introduction to Michigan Resources on Climate and Land Change Education. If this is the first time when you are participating in our speaker series, Miracle is the project focusing on climate change and land use and land cover changes here in Michigan. This year, in particular, we are focusing on human vulnerability to climate change and climate justice and climate equity. We are working with a cohort of teachers who are working with the project the entire year, and we are helping to write lesson plans and providing a variety of resources and support for middle school and high school teachers. But we are also running the second year of the speaker series for educators. And so I really want to encourage you all to mark your calendar with future presentations. So our next presentation is going to be by Paul Clements, professor from Western Michigan University, who will talk about teaching about climate justice on January 6th. All Miracle presentations are always happening on the first Thursday of the month at 4:30. So it's very easy to remember. And we are also having discussions with the Miracle cohort every second Thursday of the month, also at the same time from 4:30 to 5. So if you are interested in joining us for informal conversation next Thursday, and if you are not sure how to join, if you are not on the Blackboard with the group, definitely again, send me an email. I just dropped it in the chat, and I will send you the Zoom link for the informal conversation as well. With this, I would like to introduce the first part of our meeting today, and this will be the conversation about human vulnerability to climate change. And I will go with you today over key concepts of what is really vulnerability, what it means. I am sure that you have heard a lot about, what is human vulnerability, but let's go a little bit over the terminology. And then during the second half of our meeting, Dr. Vale will talk about the lesson plan. The star of our meeting today really could be Sam Bosner, but unfortunately he's not feeling very well, so he couldn't be online today. So we will co-present the lesson plan that he has developed. He is really the first author on the lesson plan, and we will unveil these lesson plans today. And from there, we will just go into the discussion. And again, please use your Q&A function to send questions anytime. You don't need to wait till the end of the presentation. And if you have any information to share, you can always drop it in the chat. Let's talk about climate change trends and scenarios, impacts of climate change, and go from there on into the concept of human vulnerability, which really means many things and has many different dimensions. And I will talk today about vulnerability, resilience, and 3 dimensions of vulnerability, such as exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. While we very often hear that climate change is affecting all of us and we are all in the same boat, I cannot really fully agree with this, because climate change is certainly affecting the entire world, but it's affecting different people and different groups of population and different regions in many different ways. And so when we talk about climate justice, we really cannot understand climate justice if we first don't understand what is human vulnerability, because in many ways, human vulnerability is a benchmark for working on climate justice. So there is no question that climate change is happening. There is no question that climate trends are pretty worrisome all over the world, and they have been even more worrisome during the past 50 or 60 years. We are using in this project lots of data from NASA. So although there are many other data sets that you would find, and here you have a compilation of various data sets showing quite in a good agreement how climate change has been progressing during the past century. We will be using lots of data in this and in future conversations on NASA in particular, just because this is one of the goals of our project. So we will be using lots of climate data from them. As far as the climate change scenarios for the middle of our century and for the end of our century are concerned, I'm sure there is lots of uncertainty. We might go into this nightmare 8.5 scenario. So RCP means the representative concentration pathways. And it basically depends on what will be the concentrations of carbon dioxide in future by the middle of the century and by the end of the century. And that RCP 8.5 that you see here in this orange line on the top of the graph really is a very scary scenario for the planet, right? We see here very significant increase. So here in Michigan, in kind of upper mid latitudes, we might have very significant increase of temperature, around 10 degrees, 11 degrees. Under RCP 2.6, which is the most benign scenario right now among all the scenarios developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we would still experience some women under all scenarios. We are going to experience some women, but it's going to be significantly milder. And I'm sure that you have heard about negotiations on climate change in Glasgow 2 weeks ago. So right now, with all the pledges of different nations, of different parties, we are more like somewhere in between. It's not exactly 8.5. It's not as bad, but we are far from reaching the goals of Paris Agreement. We are far from its goal to keep the woman under 1.5 or 2 degrees. We are like more right now on target to perhaps 4.5 or 5 degrees. So again, there's lots of uncertainty about it, but regardless of where we are, even with the most benign global warming, even with the best projection for climate change, even with all the mitigation measures, we are still experiencing impacts of climate change. In fact, climate change is not anymore a story about the future. It's really the story of our present. And so the impacts of climate change are here and now. We are experiencing them already. And many of those impacts would continue and become worse. And this is just a part of our reality, even with the best mitigation measures. For example, sea level rise is driven by the thermal expansion of the ocean. And so it's not going to stop, even if right now we stop all our emissions completely. The sea level rise is still going to continue, and it's going to persist probably for at least a century. Weather extremes most likely are going to accelerate, even with the best mitigation measures. So some of those impacts of climate change are of a more biophysical nature, such as droughts and floods, and of course the loss of the glaciers. Some of them are really involving also lots of socioeconomic changes. We are going to see more and more human displacement. We are going to see more and more health impacts of climate change. We are seeing already significant impacts of climate change on mental health. We are going to see more and more food insecurity and water insecurity. So are all these impacts of climate change affecting us in the same way or in different ways? Well, that's a good question. And clearly different parts of the world are affected differently. Some places have been suffering tremendous wildfires in the past few years. Others have experienced drought. Brazil is one of the breadbaskets of the world, has been affected by huge drought, while other places have been experiencing flooding at the same time. We have been talking a lot about infrastructure in this country. Well, infrastructure is crumbling in many subarctic regions in the upper latitudes because permanently frozen ground such as permafrost are melting, and we are going to see tremendous disruption of infrastructure such as pipelines and roads as a result of warmer temperatures, especially in the high latitudes. So the impacts of climate change are here and now, and they're likely to persist. But in order to strategize what to do about them, and in order to adapt, we really need to understand our vulnerability to climate change. And climate justice is impossible without measuring and assessing climate vulnerability. We also need to teach our children and our students and future generation about climate adaptation strategies. And again, in order to adapt, we need to, first of all, to understand who is vulnerable, where, why, and what to do about it. So there's a number of definitions of the term human vulnerability that you can find in the scholarly literature. And perhaps the most common definitions are the definitions proposed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this term was introduced in 2007 report as the degree to which systems are susceptible to and unable to cope with to adverse impacts of climate change, including climate vulnerability and extremes. as well as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. So this is the more recent definition. You have probably heard, or maybe not, the term climate resiliency. Everybody really wants these days to be climate resilient. Climate resiliency is important. This term is coming from biology, from ecology, and it's really about bouncing back, being able to anticipate and absorb and accommodate or recover from the effects of hazardous effects in a timely and efficient manner, including throughout ensuring the preservation, restoration, or improvement of its essential basic structures and functions. So this is another definition of resiliency or resilience by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So resilience is almost like a flip side of vulnerability. To reduce climate vulnerability, we need to be more resilient. But how we can do it? And so in order to kind of start planning our resilience, it really is very helpful to dissect the concept of vulnerability into three major areas. And so this term has been around really since mid-2000s. It's a fairly recent term, has been in the scholarly literature for a little bit more than 10 years now. And I want to bring here very powerful, in my opinion, visualization of vulnerability introduced in 2007 by Polsky and his colleagues, suggesting that vulnerability has three dimensions. It includes exposure, it includes sensitivity, and it includes adaptive capacity. And so we all can be affected by exactly the same impacts, but we are vulnerable to them in very, very different ways. So let's imagine that here in Michigan, what are our major impacts of climate change that we are experiencing in Michigan already? Well, flooding for sure. We are experiencing abnormal amounts of precipitation in spring and in summer, very often localized during very short period of time. And so we are experiencing flooding already. We will experience more flooding in the future. When people are experiencing flooding, even at the level of one city, of one community, certainly not everybody is experiencing the same impact of climate change, such as flooding or drought or wildfire or heat wave in the same way. Just depending on where your house is located, are you living on the hill? Are you living on the floodplain? Are you living in a highly polluted area, or are you living in the very wooded suburb? Would largely define how vulnerable you are to a particular impact of climate change. And because we have so many structural inequalities in urban planning, we see that the same communities that are affected by exactly the same impact of climate change, such as heat wave in summer or a flood in spring, live this experience very, very differently. So it can be anything from very benign few days spending at home, working from home, to the questions of life and death. People are dying as a result of the same impacts, while other people are working on their laptops in the safety of their houses. So where you are, where exactly you are within the same community, largely defines what is your exposure. So I'm introducing the first component of human vulnerability, exposure. The second component is sensitivity. We are sensitive to exactly the same impacts of climate change in very different ways, depending on our age, depending on our gender, health, wellness, race, fitness, mobility, occupation, and lifestyle. So something to brainstorm perhaps in your classroom with your students. We might be all experiencing the same exposure. We might be all living in the same part of the city, which is experiencing exactly the same flood or exactly the same heat wave. But depending on your age, or depending on your fitness, or depending on your gender, these could be very different experiences in terms of your predisposition to the cardiovascular diseases, to heat strokes, to your ability to evacuate during the flood, and so on. And finally, I want to take us from there to the third dimension of vulnerability, which is adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity essentially means all the assets, all the resources that we have, either at the individual level or at the community level, that we can use to cope with the impact, to avoid the impact, to be resilient to it, and to adapt. And so this can be anything from access to information, knowing what is your evacuation plan, having education, having access to transportation, having access to insurance, having access to money, having access to other resources. So again, the same exposure to flood might have very different consequences for one person just checking in into the hotel and driving away in their vehicle. For others, relying on shelters and evacuation provided by the community. So you can see that human vulnerability really has these three big components: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And it has positive correlation with exposure, positive correlation with sensitivity, and negative correlation with adaptive capacity. Let's take a look at one example. So I'm going to use as a case study very recent flooding event in Midland County in Michigan. You probably all remember about this flood from the news. It happened a year ago in May 2020. So you can see these two images. The first image of Midland just before the flooding, and then the second when the entire area is covered by this mudslide. And so 10,000 residents from Edenville and Sanford counties had to be evacuated. So Edenville and Sanford in Midland County had to be evacuated. So what happened? Well, there was this abnormous amount of precipitation. There were more than 4 inches that fell during a very short period of time in less than 48 hours. And then Edenville Dam collapsed on May 19th, sending all this flood water through the community. And then about an hour later, water spilled over Sanford Dam, and then there were even more flooding. And so all these people had to be evacuated. Now, the question is, so the impact is the same. What about exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity? So in my classes, I often invite my students just to sit down and brainstorm in small groups how this particular impact of climate change is going to affect different levels of vulnerability of different groups in your community. And so let's talk, like, what does it mean in terms of exposure? What does it mean in terms of sensitivity? And what does it mean in terms of adaptive capacity? So I'm just going to pause for a moment, and you might want to, and don't hesitate to drop your comments in the chat and drop your thoughts in the chat. Who is going to be affected more? Who is going to be affected less? What do you think about exposure of all these different groups? What do you think about sensitivity of these groups? And what do you think about adaptive capacity of these different groups? I wanted to share some additional reading resources on, if you're looking for resources on the concept of human vulnerability. Here are a few readings, and I'm also going to drop them in the chat, and you can find them in, you can also find them in a copy of my PowerPoint on the Blackboard. And if you are not a part of the Miracle cohort, you can always send me an email, and I will send you this bibliography.